Hello, everyone. I'm Shahab, Bakhtiari, and today we are going to talk about deep learning. And this is a gentle introduction to deep learning in the sense that it's not going to it will not dive very deep into the technical details of deep learning, but it will mostly focus on the high-level concepts and it will be basically an introduction to these different things that have been introduced in the domain of deep learning over the last 30, 40 years. And they have become quite popular in the last 10 years and very successful. So we will talk about deep learning in the first part of this session. In the next part, we will have some hands-on sessions that students in my lab have put together. And you can basically get familiar with how these kind of concepts are implemented today using Python and PyTorch library. So, okay, who we are? We are basically I'm the PI of the System Neuroscience and AI lab, or the SNAIL, and we are a team of 9, 10 people that are doing research at the intersection of neuroscience and AI or deep learning. Basically, we are using deep learning to model the brain, and we use our knowledge of the brain to hopefully develop better AI. This is the research that we are doing in the lab, and basically what we will do today has nothing much to do with the research that we do in the lab. We'll just go over deep learning, but I think there's only one slide that I will mention something about the research that we are doing in the lab. So, okay. Well, it has become very difficult to not notice the recent advances in AI. Like, I think most of us has at least a few times tried AIs like ChatGPT. Or if you're like myself, you have been using it in a daily basis. It's part of my toolbox now. Depending on different behaviors that you want AI show, we have different types of AI. We can have like generative AI that just based on a very simple description or a detailed one, actually, you can generate these naturalistic, nice figures that, again, most of you are now familiar with. We have robotics. Now, over the last few years, robotics has also progressed quite significantly. Now we can actually, again, thanks to these kind of like tech language models, we can ask robots to do this very complicated task that we were not even imagining about 5, 6 years ago. And most recently, we have these video models that are able to generate these very naturalistic videos given a very detailed description of what they want to see in this generated video. So all sorts of AIs have been developed over the last 10 years with different capabilities, right? But really under the hood, we're dealing with a concept called deep learning. It's a framework in which we design these models. We kind of like move around different components of the deep learning framework to build these different models. So when we're talking about developing such AI models, we're actually thinking of how and exactly what needs to be changed in a deep learning framework to develop these models, right? So this is what we will do today. We will basically talk about these concepts of deep learning, these important concepts. So what are these elements? So one of the most important elements is the architecture of your artificial neural network. So this is basically the elements that are put together that takes the input, process it, generates the output, right? This is the architecture of your model. And over the last many, many years, people have been playing with these architectures, trying to make them better and better for different downstream purposes. Another important element of deep learning is the objective function. So you want your AI to show a specific behavior. This specific behavior or goal is defined via the objective function. So you basically define an objective function that dictates the behavior that you desire in your neural. And this is something that, again, we'll introduce and talk about today. The third element is the learning rule. So your architecture has so many parameters. It takes the input, it processes and gives us the output. But it also needs to be trained. Like all these parameters in your network need to be tuned to do this specific task or show this specific behavior. What is that learning rule? For 99% of the recent progress in AI, this learning rule is always gradient descent. We haven't seen variants of it because it works so efficiently and so well. Again, we will talk about this today. We have a lot of architectures. We have a lot of objective functions, but learning rule actually has been always almost the same. So we'll talk about that. And then there's the training data. So it's like all samples of inputs, all samples of output that you basically fit the whole network to do this specific task or show this specific behavior using this data. The data is basically representing the behavior that we want the model to show. So when we put together all these components, the architecture, we define the objective function, we know the learning rule, and we put together the data set, then we have a deep neural network that ideally shows the behavior that we are interested in. So today, at least in this presentation, we will go over all these different components, and we will give some examples of what people have been developing. So let's start with the smallest part of this component, which is a single artificial neuron or a single artificial unit. So the idea of an artificial neuron is a crude model of a biological neuron. So you are familiar probably with a neuron, a real neuron. It's a cell in the brain that is in charge of doing all the processing. It is believed to be the smallest computational unit in the brain. It takes the input, it basically combines them somehow and generates an output. So it has different components over the dendrites. The cell is actually receiving all the inputs from other different cells. It kind of integrates them, how and with what kind of computation, we'll not get into it, but it will integrate these inputs and generate action potentials that are these sudden changes in the membrane potential of the cell and pass it to the next cell through the axon here, right? So we have inputs integrated somehow, and then a firing of the neuron generated and sent to the next neuron over the axon, right? And people have shown that there's a nonlinear function between a nonlinear relationship between the membrane potential of the cell and the firing rate. So the action potentials that are generated here in the axon hillock and passed through to the next cell, there's a nonlinear relationship. So basically, up to a threshold, when you change the voltage of the membrane, the firing rate doesn't change. After a threshold, it suddenly starts increasing. So this nonlinearity is very important. It's a key component of a cell, of a neuron, right? And it's also an important component of an artificial neuron. So it has become crudely simplified to give us this artificial unit, this artificial neuron. So again, we have a bunch of inputs, integrated, we have a weighted integration of the inputs, summed together and passed through a nonlinearity to generate the output, right? And we have a nonlinearity that kind of resembles nonlinearity in a cell. Okay, so up to a threshold, again, changing the input doesn't change the output, but after a certain threshold, it just increases linearly in this specific nonlinearity. Okay, so even if you don't have the nonlinearity, still you have a computational unit, right? So you have a unit here that is adding x1 and x2 in a linear fashion, weighted, added a bias, and generates the output. And even this unit is a linear unit, but still it can do something for us, right? So you have, like, for example, this unit can define this decision surface. Anything on one side of this decision surface can be assigned to one class, and the other side of the surface can be assigned to another class, right? So still can do something that is linearly separable in the space of x1 and x2, right? But when you have a nonlinear function, a nonlinear relationship between input and output, then that single linear unit is useless. So here we have the most famous, I think, nonlinear function in this domain, an XOR function. So the output is either true or false, but it is true only when x2 and x1 are either both 1 or both 0. And when one of them is 1 and the other one is 0, it is true, sorry. And then when both are 1 or 0, it's false. This, you can't solve this. So you can't really classify these samples just with a linear surface. So you need a nonlinearity, right? So it has been shown that if you put together some neurons that now have this nonlinearity there, you can actually solve this XOR problem. This was a moment 50 years ago that people had started thinking about artificial neural networks as an important part of our machine learning toolbox. Okay. And basically the same idea holds by putting together many of these artificial units, layers of these artificial units, connect them all together with the nonlinearity, and you have something called multi-layer perceptron, right? It is the simplest type of artificial neural network that has been introduced and has been used for a long time, and has actually become even more popular recently over the last 2-3 years. So again, you have inputs. You have a layer of artificial units connected to the inputs. You have a second hidden layer, connected to the first layer, and then all together they generate the output, right? And if you write down the equation, it will look like something like this. You have X input multiplied by weights here, and then summed with the bias term, which is a scalar value, and passed through this nonlinearity shown by sigma here. And again, the next layer, and so on. And it has been shown that this entity, multi-layer perceptron, is a general function approximator, in the sense that any kind of function can theoretically be learned by this model. No matter what are you interested in, what is the function that you want to model, this is able to model. Okay? But in practice, it's not always the case, right? This is what all these generations of artificial neural networks have been developed. Because if it could really learn everything, then we wouldn't bother with generating and coming up with other types of these neural networks, right? But in practice, this is not what this MLP can do. So you can use this MLP for different things, but the data set that probably, this is probably the most used data set in machine learning. It's the MNIST data set. It's a digit category, digit classification. You have handwritten digits of 0 to 9 images. You give the images as input. The network should basically tell us which digit that image contains. There's a classification problem. The output of the network should give us a probability for each category of digit, right? So I will show the network an image of 0, and then it should give me a probability of how likely it is 0 or 1 or 2 or 3, etc. So this is the classification problem. It's a very basic example of classification. So again, more precisely, we have the input samples, x1 to xn, all the samples that we have in this classification problem. We have the outputs that are labels of all these samples. And they basically, so this is multi-layer perceptron. You pass the input to the network, and it gives you a set of outputs. The number of outputs equals to the number of classes, here 10. Then it passes through a nonlinearity called softmax, which turns these values, Z1 to ZC, into probabilities. Now we will have Q1 to QC, which is the probability of each class, given a specific input. It normalizes these Z values to give us these probabilities. They sum to 1, and they're between 0 and 1. And so this is basically the architecture of the network. We talked about the training data set, and again, we need a training objective, right? How do we want to force this model to learn classification of these digits? And here we defined the cross-entropy loss, right? This is the loss function that is most often used to do a classification task. And what it does is that basically it forces the model to increase the probability of a correct class. Okay, the way that it is defined, basically. Okay, so for a correct class, this will be a low value because it's a loss, right? So for a correct classification, it should have a loss. It should have a very small value. But for an incorrect class, it will have a high value. You decrease the loss throughout training to force the model to do what we are interested in. Now, Well, we have the loss function. Now we need an optimization process to force the model to do this task, right? So we had the architecture, and as I told you, the architecture has all these connections, right? W1, W2, W3. These are all values that connect every neuron to another neuron. All these parameters need to be optimized in order to do this task. So we have the loss function. Now, here we have something that we call a loss landscape. Well, it's a very simplified version of a loss landscape. The vertical axis shows you this loss value that defines how well your model is performing. The x-axis is just one weight. Imagine that your network only had one weight, okay? And as you change this W, the weight, let's say one weight that this network has, the loss will change, right? It will decrease and then increase depending on the weight value. What we really want to do with this network is to make sure that the weights are here around the lowest value of loss. Okay, so when we initialize a network, by initialization, it means that we set all the parameters of network to random values. We end up somewhere on this loss landscape. Imagine that we're here at the beginning. What we really want to do is that we want to kind of move weights so that we move in this direction along the red arrow, right? So how do we do that? We use a technique called gradient descent. And what gradient descent does is that at this location, at this very location that we are on the loss landscape, it calculates the gradient of the loss with respect to the weight. What it means is that it calculates the slope here, slope of this curve at the beginning with respect to this parameter, and moves in the opposite direction of this gradient. If it goes along the direction, it will actually go up. So we want to move it down, so we move in the opposite direction of the loss, at the gradient. And if you keep doing this over and over, we will reach the minimum, right? So this is how you define the gradient. You have some current value of weights, and then we subtract the gradient of the loss. So it's shown by J, but it's the same loss, it's L. So this is the gradient of the loss with respect to the weight. We subtract that from the current value of the weights, give us the next value of weights. And we keep doing this over and over. Okay, this is how we update these parameters. It has this important component that is loss, and it has this rule, which is your learning rule. It's the gradient descent rule. Okay, all the networks, all the AI that you see these days is trained with this technique. There is a bit of subtlety here. If you want to estimate this gradient, which is the slope of the loss at that specific point, you have to calculate this gradient over all the samples in your data set, average them, and subtract them from the current value of the weight. But this is very expensive computationally. Instead, what people do is that they take a sample from the data set and they estimate the gradient only over those samples. Okay, and they basically subtract it from the weight and update the weights of the network. Of course, this is an estimation of this, right? This batch gradient descent is an estimation of the true gradient descent. So it introduces some errors in the process, but this is what we can afford, right? This is what we do. So you don't want your batch size is samples that over which you calculate the gradient. You don't want your batch size to be small because it will make your estimation of gradient noisy. So your network will bounce around during training and the convergence will be slow. If it is too big, it will not fit into your device, in your hardware, in your memory. You can't do that, right? So the rule of thumb, it's a rule of thumb. It's not always true, but the rule of thumb is that choose the batch size that is large, the largest batch that fits into your memory. It's not always true, so take it with a grain of salt. But this is what you can start. Any questions? Just let me know. If you have any questions here or people over Zoom, if you have questions, you can just type it in the chat or you can tell me. And I can spend more time on any concepts that you're interested in. Okay. And if you're, of course, familiar with machine learning, like any other machine learning technique, you need to do cross-validation. You will train it on a part of the data set. You will test and validate on another part of this. Because you don't want to overfit your data. You don't want your model to just learn whatever it is in that data set. You want your model to actually be able to do something outside this data set. So we will split it to train and test and validation, which again is true for any kind of machine learning, not just for deep learning. So far, we talked about artificial neurons, how we put them together to build a multi-layer perceptron. How do we do a simple classification with multi-layer perceptron? And how do we basically optimize the network to do that task? This is basically the main concepts that you have in AI. Now, everything that comes after this and what people have done over the last 20 years, 30 years, is just variations of the same idea. Okay? There's nothing that you don't know about any AI that you take. Just with these concepts, you should know everything about that AI technique. So now let's talk about, so basically, by the way, we have three hands-on practices. The first hands-on practice will cover up to here. Okay, and then after that, we will go to the second part. So I will tell you that what exactly each hands-on is covering. So convolutional neural networks. So people were interested in doing image classification because it is very useful in real world. Like you want to put cameras around, and then the camera be able to do like recognize the stuff for you, right? Recognize cats, recognize dogs, recognizes letters, recognizes digits, as I mentioned. So dealing with images have been quite popular in the field of machine vision and AI in general. But multi-layer perceptrons that I introduced to you is not very efficient in that sense. So people came up with the idea of convolutional neural networks. But what is that exactly? So let's start with the MLPs, the multi-layer perceptrons that we had so far. So we want to deal with this image, right? The image of a cat. We want to feed it to the network, and then we ask the network to recognize it if it is a cat or a dog. So for MLPs, what we do is that we take the image, which is 256 by 256, for example. We vectorize it, flatten it. So it will be just one-dimensional vector, and feed it to this network. So every unit here now, like the gray units, are the pixels of the image, right? They're connected to the next layer and the output. Imagine that we have only two layers, and each layer only has 20 neurons. Okay. So if you just do a back of the envelope calculations, this network, this very basic network, has about 1.3 million parameters. So the input image is not even large. The network only has two layers, and each layer only has 20 neurons. This is almost nothing compared to what we have today in our deep neural networks. So 1.3 million parameters means that training this network is hell. You can't easily train this network. And you also need a lot of data samples to train this network. Otherwise, you will definitely overfit. So this is why, well, people start thinking that, well, MLPs are not probably very useful when you want to deal with images. But what is this network really doing when you're training it? So each unit here, which is a hidden unit in your network, it is receiving a bunch of inputs, right? It is receiving inputs from every pixel in the image, right? The weights are set, the weights over these black, grayish weights are set during training. And basically, the network is learning to be a feature detector for one part of your image. So assume that this has become, throughout training, a feature detector for a vertical edge at this top left corner of your image, right? Now, if you look at another unit in the network, it is the same feature detector, but only for like somewhere around the center of the image. So you see the redundancy, right? It is a feature detector, but it has become a feature detector. It has been learning feature detectors for every location on this image. This is very redundant. we know in natural images, we have something called a spatial invariance, meaning that the distribution of features, visual features, is invariant to the location of that feature. You have as many vertical orientations in the center as you have in the corners of an image, statistically speaking. So we don't really need to learn all these feature detectors for every location on this image. We can only learn one feature detector and then use it to process the whole image. And this is the main idea behind convolutional neural networks. So instead of learning a feature per location in the image, you only learn a feature detector that is like a vertical edge. And what you do is that you start moving it around on the image. You put it here, and the filter will tell you if there is a vertical edge there or not. You move it to the next location and it does the same thing, and so on. And if you do it over and over for this black filter, you will get a black feature map. The feature map tells you the distribution of vertical orientations throughout the image. For another filter, the red one here, it will give you another feature map that tells you the distribution of that feature over the whole image. This is the idea of convolution, right? So you take a filter, you move it across an image, do an inner product at every location, and put them together to get this feature maps. Now you can see that how many less number of parameters you need to do this kind of visual processing. So this idea was, well, it was introduced before in 70s, but in 1980s, Yang LeCun made this idea very popular by putting it together as a convolutional neural network. And also it became commercialized for identifying letters and digits in handwritten text and input. This was actually the whole idea behind using basically an AI back then in 1980 to read checks in a bank. So this was automatically done even in the 1980s just by using this technique. And the idea was introduced at the end of 1980s, but throughout the whole 1990s, they didn't really see the success that they deserved. Because these networks require a lot of data to train, right? There are so many parameters, and you need to see variance of the input for every class. So it needs a lot of data. But in 2010-ish, ImageNet was introduced, which is a very huge data set of images, natural images, per 1,000 categories. Where originally there were 21,000 categories, but the one that was mostly used is it had 1,000 categories. So with millions of images in total, now you could actually train these neural networks. So this is what happened in 2012, and the famous AlexNet was proposed. With some modifications in the architecture of a neural network and convolutional neural network, using the AlexNet dataset, in 2012, they could actually decrease the margin of error by 10.8% on ImageNet, right? This was a huge improvement over the previously proposed methods. And after that, we had a revival of deep learning and artificial neural networks. They became very popular. And since then, they have been the dominant technique in AI and machine vision and machine learning in general. So there were three components that needed to be put together to reach that level of success. So it was the big data, the ImageNet data set. It was the deep convolutional neural network. It was much deeper than the previous versions. And it also needed to do this kind of training on a graphical processing unit. So before that, like any kind of processing that you do in a computer, most of them they were being done on a CPU. But people basically realized in 2012 from Jeff Hinton's group, they realized that you can use GPU to do the same processes. It became much faster. And these things together gave us the success of AlexNet. And since then, since 2012, people have been trying to modify this architecture of a convolutional neural network to make it better and better for solving ImageNet. So ImageNet became basically a test bed of success for these models. For example, in 2014, VGGs were proposed. One of the main innovations of VGGs was that the convolutional filters, the ones that I talked about previously, they became very small, like 3 by 3. People showed that this is enough for doing this task. If you have like 3 by 3 filter, a kernel, it's enough to do this task. And then they came up actually with a technique to make this network deeper and deeper. So now we had, like, for example, VGG19 had 19 layers of processing, which is a lot compared to the previous versions. In 2017, I think, resonance were introduced. And the main, again, innovation in resonance was that they introduced something called a skip connection. Skip connection is, so if you have the input, it goes through some convolutional layers, but then also a skip connection will add the original input to the output of this. And just the mere introduction of these skip connections help the network to learn much more efficiently. And they get rid of a problem called vanishing gradients, which was a problem when you were making these networks very, very deep. So adding these skip connections added a lot of efficiency and interesting dynamics in training these neural networks. And I think since then, resonance have been the most popular and successful neural networks architectures in machine vision. And also the idea of residual blocks, like these kind of blocks, even were introduced in other architectures, like transformers, for example, that you see, and you hear a lot about them now in most advanced methods. We'll not talk about that, but the same idea is also there. So as I said, since 2012, up until now, people have been playing around with these architectures, and now we can, like, the state of the art on ImageNet is higher than 90% accuracy, which is a lot. Like 1,000 classes classified based on all the input images by the accuracy of over 90%. It's almost a noise ceiling. So higher than that is probably just overfitting to the noise. So just one slide on NeurAI, the type of research that we do in the lab. These models, these models trained on ImageNet are not just good for machine vision, they're not just good for categorization. People have shown that these models are also quite good for modeling the primates and human and monkeys visual system. So if you compare, for example, a layer of this network with different layers of visual processing in a monkey brain, you see resemblances. And this, again, in 2014, this was shown. It again started a revolution in how we think and model the visual system in animals and primates and non-primate animals. And this is basically what we do in the lab. We are trying to still come up with better variants of deep learning that can better and better model the visual system and also learning in the brain. So we saw that why convolutional neural networks were introduced, because we want them to be more efficient and we want them to be able to learn more complicated visual tasks. And we saw that basically the same architecture was changed over time to make it better and better for these kind of like visual tasks. Now, if you want to take a model and, let's imagine that you have your own task of interest, you want to train your neural network to do that task. Well, so let's say flower classification. Usually in most data sets that we don't have enough number of samples per category, because we will need a lot of samples per category to make sure that the network can learn invariances per category, things that the network should ignore when, for example, deciding if there's this category of flower in the image. So it should basically ignore the luminance of the image, it should ignore the angle of the photo that was taken, and so on. So you need many, many samples per category. And usually for like day-to-day data sets that we have, this is not the case. So we do something called transfer learning. So for transfer learning, we take a model that is already pre-trained on a very large data set, like ImageNet. And what we do then is that we kind of like fine-tune or change this network so it fits to our data set of interest or a task of interest. Okay, this is called transfer learning. There are two approaches to do transfer learning. One is that you can basically just take this network, remove this last layer, add a new layer, and just train that layer to do flower classification. This is one way to do it. It's called linear probe, and it actually works quite well. You will see in one of the hands-on sessions how you can do it actually, and you can see that it's for some set of tasks, it's actually very efficient. The other way to do it is to add this layer, but also as you're retraining the network, also change all the parameters in the network, so-called fine-tuning. Okay, so you gradually change and you like slightly change all the weights in the network. Okay, this is sometimes necessary when this data set is quite away from the original pre-training data set. You can even go beyond classification. You can take the same network, a pre-trained network, now train it to do object detection or segmentation or anything like that. This is still doable. So I will briefly talk about, so now it's the last part of this presentation. I will briefly talk about self-supervised learning. So far, what we were doing was dealing with pairs of inputs and outputs. So we had an image of a cat, and we had a label that this is a cat, and an image of a dog, labeled as a dog. So we had pairs of input and output. But in reality, when humans are learning to see, when human kids are developing, they don't have these pairs of input and output. Like a kid is playing around with toys and objects, depending on the age, interacting with them, touching them, moving them around, right? But they don't have labels. Like it's not like someone is sitting there and telling them, oh, this is a I don't know, wooden rectangle or something like that. So they don't have these labels, right? What they do is that in a self-supervised manner, they're learning to process visual input, they're learning to see the input, right? So this is called self-supervised learning and unsupervised learning. This has been one of the most important goals in AI because, you know, having labeled data is expensive. You need humans to sit in front of a screen and label every sample. There's a cat, there's a dog, there's a cat, there's a dog. This is expensive and really boring, right? But we have a lot of data on the internet around us without label. So in AI, ideally, we wanted to be able to use this data to learn, to process visual input. This is called self-supervised learning. And again, over many, many years, people have been introducing and inventing different techniques to do self-supervised learning. I categorize them into two groups, a generative approach and a non-generative approach. And so one of the examples of a generative approach is an autoencoder. So the network is trained to receive the raw data, X, as input, process it via an encoder, which is again a convolutional neural network, let's say, create a latent embedding called Z, and then from Z, reconstruct the input. So now you have the input, also at the output, you have some estimation or reconstruction of the input. If you see, there is no label, right? It's an image of a cat in the input. There's an image of a cat at the output, right? And so this is basically, if you want to write down the equation, it looks like something like this. Well, this is not decoder. This is encoder, actually. Sorry. So the encoder processes the input, gives it to the output, to the decoder. The decoder generates the input again. And the loss function is a reconstruction loss, right? So you, throughout training, you decrease the reconstruction loss of the network. And once the network is trained, you can take this latent embedding, Z, which is the output of the encoder, and use it for different purposes, for example, object categorization. Okay? Throughout training, the network is not seeing any labels, but once the network is trained, you can use this latent embedding of the input to do a classification, cat versus dogs. Right? So even if you take the most modern architectures that underlie those image generation at the beginning or those video generations, the same idea of an autoencoder is there, right? You have an encoder that encodes the input and a decoder that decodes and builds, again, generates inputs, right? So I'm not going into the details, but I just wanted to mention that this idea of autoencoder or encoder-decoder has been very popular in the field. And it has been still being used to generate, to use for generative AI. But there's another approach, and I'm calling it a non-generative approach, right? Here, your network is not trained to generate input samples, to reconstruct input samples. So this is one of the examples. It's called joint embedding parallel architectures, or JPA in short. What it does is that it receives the inputs, right? It passes it through a convolutional neural network. And also it receives a transformed version of the input it goes through the convolutional neural network, and then the network is trained to maximize the similarity between these two embeddings, Z1 and Z2. So the network is kind of trained to say that, well, X and transform X are the same or similar, right? So this is an example. A bird goes through a network, the rotated bird also goes through the network, and the network is forced to say that, well, these are the same things. This is another approach to train these networks, and the learning, the network will learn representations that are invariant to this transformation. So when the network sees a rotated bird, it will sit still as a bird, which is good. This is how our vision is also built. So to kind of like train these networks, we have these losses that is minimizing the distance between Z1 and Z2, Z2 hat and Z2, here and here. But also it has some extra terms, because I'm not going to details, but if you don't put these extra terms, these regularization terms, the network can learn something trivial. The network can, map everything to 0, and still 0 minus 0 would be 0. So in order to avoid that, we also have like some regularization terms or some other techniques to deal with this problem. You can also train it on videos. So now the video is actually trained to kind of like be similar, like the latent representation of t-2 be similar to t-1, t, and so on. So it is learning representations that are kind of making sure that as a video is moving forward, representations are not changing much. It is learning invariance to whatever is happening through a video. Just for you to know that, there are also different ways to do this. Once the network is trained, again, you can take the latent embedding and use it for a purpose like object categorization. And again, throughout years, since 2017, 16, people have come up with different versions of this approach to still test on ImageNet. And you can see that even these models that are not seeing the label of the data, can reach about 80% accuracy on ImageNet, which is very impressive. So these models also do work. And the good thing about these models is that you can use data sets. You can use basically any images that you can get your hands on to train this network. So we learned about multilayer perceptrons and classification. We looked at optimization and gradient descent. We talked about convolutional neural networks and how they're important for dealing with images that are high dimensional, and we also want them to be efficient in learning. We briefly talked about transfer learning. So the first MLP classification and optimization is what you can play around with in the first hands-on session. In the convolutional neural networks and transfer learning is what you can play a bit with in the second hands-on. And the self-supervised learning, mostly autoencoders, is what you can do in the last hands-on session. So we talked about these concepts, but I really briefly talked about all of them, right? First of all, there are also topics that I didn't even mention, and I think like reinforcement learning, for example. I highly suggest Neuromatch Academy. Some of the materials that you just saw, I took them from Neuromatch Academy materials. So I really suggest to go through these if you want to learn more about all these details and all the like they have talks by the best in the world, and also they have very interesting hands-on sessions that you can also practice. And here are the contributors to these well, the hands-on sessions mostly that you will have. Well, for the hands-on sessions, as I said, we have 3 of them. And what you only need to do is that you can choose whatever interests you. You don't really need to start from the first one and go to the last one. They cover different topics. And depending on your interest, you can start with whatever you're interested in. And yeah, then we can spend time together as you go through it. If you have questions, or if you can, I suggest that really, like as you're going through the hands-ons, play around with it, change the stuff, and see how it affects the output, see how it affects the behavior of the code, if you get an error or not. But for each session now, one of the contributors will come and explain that what you will see in each test.
Hi everyone. The first thing I ask you to do is you can just make a copy of this notebook and make it here, so that not everyone run on the same notebook. So this is this notebook is just introduction about multi-layer perceptron. So we have basically two main data sets. There's one that we generate with different functions, and there's one on MNIST or the handwritten digit data set. So in the first block, we just import libraries. In this block, we have this different functions of sign, and we can also add noise. So the purpose of this data set is to train your model to basically learn these functions with some added noise. Here we define our multi-layer perceptron. It's very simple. You have one linear layer and one non-linearity called ReLU, and also another layer that generates output that you want. Here you can here's the main code or the functions of how we train the model. We put it the notes and details explanation of what each of them does. I just go over them quickly now. Here you can play around with the function you want. You can choose any function, sine, cosine, anything. Different levels of frequency, noise levels, number of your samples, the learning rate that you want your model to be trained on, and the split ratio, which basically splits the training and testing of your data. In this block, you can basically visualize your data, you run this, and then the different functions, you can see how the data looks like. And here is the code for running training the model. You run these cells, and you will see the plot of how the models is fitting to this data set. And you can test the model on changing the frequency of the noise levels and the frequency. And here is the MNIST data set. So here you choose the batch size that you want to train your model on, the learning rate that you want to train, and the number of epochs or the training that requires a model to be trained. And here is that you download the MNIST data sets, and you put it into the data loader. Here again is our multi-layer perceptron. It's the same structure as before. You have linear layer and ReLU and output. And here you can, this is a function for cross-validation. And this is the main training part. You run this. At the end of this, you will get an accuracy, the training accuracy, and the test accuracy or the validation accuracy and loss. And here we basically put this visualization of loss landscape. We ask you to not run this cell, basically these two cells, because they take so much time. This is just a way to show that how the loss will change if you perturb the weights into different directions. So this is the main part of the MLP. If you have any question, please ask me or Charlotte. We'll answer.
So, for the second notebook, we will cover convolutional neural network, and so we will use we are going to do the image classification task. So, we will use the CIFAR10 dataset, which we have 10 classes of different images. We will show you how we can define a dataset and data load in PyTorch. Then we will start with training a regular neural network and showing that why they are inefficient for image classification tasks. Then we will show you how to define a convolutional neural network model and do the same task, and you can compare it with the regular model and also compare the parameters. You can also change the parameter of both CNN and regular model if you want. And for the next part, we will use the AlexNet classification on the CIFAR10. So we will use a pre-trained AlexNet that was pre-trained on an ImageNet, and we want to fine-tune it on CIFAR10 dataset. And we will use two strategies. First is freezing. We will add a new dense layer on top of the AlexNet and freeze all layers so the weight doesn't change anymore, and just the weight of last layer will change. And in this second strategy, we don't freeze the layers of the defined AlexNet, and we will we will fine tune all layers respect to the new data set. And you can also compare you can see the train loss and accuracy for these models. And you can play with parameters here also.
So in the last notebook, we'll do some self-supervised learning. We'll do basically doing an autoencoder with convolutional layers. And we're trying to reconstruct the MNIST digits. So in the first part, it's basically just loading the data as before. Then I want you to define the autoencoder, basically. I described how you can do it, how the arguments for each of the layers are, and then you can define it yourself. You have had a lot of time in the other notebooks, like how you do it, and you've been shown it. So maybe it's time to do it yourself, define your own networks, play around with the number of layers and so on. And then basically you have given, so basically it shows you how to do an encoder, decoder, and then define the autoencoder. And there's, some more information, but then you will train it and evaluate it. So the evaluation, basically you can plot the latent space, so the Z vectors, so you can do PCA on that and just visualize the landscape, see if there's some clusters of digits, if you can see something in there. And then you will also do linear probing on this latent vector on the Z space. So you'll train a network that takes the encoder, freezes it, and then just trains a linear layer on top, the linear probe, and tries to classify the digits. So you'll see if that works or not. And then if you want to read more about this kind of techniques, there's some additional architectures you can look into.
Okay, perfect. So as I said, you can basically start with any one of these notebooks, anything that interests you more, and we'll be around to answer questions. And if you're curious to mess up with the codes, feel free to do it. So thank you all.